before the blade ever touched the neck of the woman France had come to despise. Her fate had already been sealed. Ending her life wasn't enough. Her identity had to be wiped away, turned into a public spectacle of humiliation. Marie Antoinette, the once radiant Archduchess of Austria who had lit up the halls of Versailles with her laughter, was now being forced to walk the path backward, from the splendor of a golden throne to the rough wooden cart reserved for the condemned. If you're drawn to real history, where innocence is destroyed in silence, subscribe. This isn't a myth, it's the slow breaking of a young woman the world chose to hate. Before the screams, before the blade, Marie Antoinette was just a girl, frightened, isolated, and already condemned. Comment where you're watching from and stay with me. Because her execution wasn't the tragedy. What came before, it was far worse. In the early hours of August 2nd, 1793, while Paris still hid beneath a heavy silence, she was ripped from the arms of her family. Torn from her children, denied even a moment of comfort, she was carried off to the Conciergerie, a damp, shadowy prison that Parisians grimly nicknamed the waiting room of the guillotine. There was no queen anymore, only prisoner number 280. Her new court consisted of rats, sweating stone walls, and 2 guards who stared at her without blinking. Every movement was recorded, every small attempt at dignity blocked. The hours melted into one another under the constant dripping from the ceiling, mixed with the muffled whispers of other prisoners awaiting their turn outside. And while the revolution howled beyond those walls, while people who once bowed before her silks now demanded her execution, another story was unfolding inside that cell. The story of the woman behind the symbol. A woman forced to face not only death, but a deliberate attempt to crush her spirit before she reached the scaffold. This is the story of what they did to Marie Antoinette before the guillotine claimed her. A story in which humiliation clashed with dignity, and where, in the most unlikely place, she discovered her final crown in the quiet endurance of suffering. Time no longer followed clocks. It was measured by the thud of guard boots and the distant murmur of the Seine brushing against stone. Marie Antoinette lived in a cramped, soaked cell where moisture clung to everything, the walls, the blankets, even her own skin. A pile of straw served as her bed. A single candle became her only companion. A wooden screen half divided the room, and behind it she was expected to dress and undress. But even this faint shred of privacy was forbidden. 2 soldiers stood watch day and night, denying her the right to be unseen. She slept under their eyes. She ate under their eyes. The surveillance wasn't merely control. It was a reminder that she was no longer queen, no longer mother, barely even considered human. Just a body under guard. News from the outside faded into distorted murmurs, echoes from a world that had moved on without her. Yet one memory remained painfully alive. One wound that refused to close, the memory of her son, Louis Charles. Only a month earlier, in the Temple prison, revolutionaries had stormed his room past midnight searching for the little prince. Marie Antoinette had thrown herself over him, pleading desperately, "He's only a child." Her cries meant nothing. The guards tore her away as the terrified 8-year-old was dragged from her arms. His screams stayed trapped inside her mind, replaying endlessly in the darkness. She would never see him again. Something inside her cracked that night, not the queen, but the mother. Among the handful of objects she hid from the guards, she kept a tiny portrait of her son and a lock of his hair tucked inside her corset. It was her relic, the last ember of warmth in a world frozen by fury. Her only source of human kindness was Rosalie Lemorlier, a young servant assigned to care for her. Rosalie later confessed that the queen only broke down when she spoke of her children. Then, the facade of royalty fell away, revealing a devastated mother whispering her children's names like a prayer. Even this vulnerability became a game for her captors. They mocked her, taunted her with crude comments, laughed about her executed husband. Every insult was meant to wound her. Every silence was her attempt to resist. But in that suffocating cell, surrounded by hostility, Marie Antoinette began bending her pain into defiance. She learned to move slowly, speak softly, show no fear. Those watching her expected a shattered woman. Instead, they saw someone who, even stripped of crown and title, still carried a strange, unspoken authority. Sometimes, when the others slept, she stared at her candle's trembling flame. In its faint glow, she replayed her entire life. The grand balls, the embroidered gowns, her children laughing in the palace gardens, and the rising tide of resentment that had been swelling just outside Versailles. When had everything begun to unravel? When had they stopped being people and become symbols of hatred? No answer ever arrived, only dawn. And with it, Another day inside that tiny stone coffin. Beyond the walls, she heard the city vendors shouting, revolutionary drums, the distant bells of Notre Dame, reminding her that life went on without her. And so 76 days passed. 76 dawns without hope. During those long weeks, the woman once despised by an entire nation was stripped of everything that made her human. Yet from that stripping, something unexpected formed. A quiet, almost sacred composure. A dignity that appears only in those who have already lost everything and have nothing left to fear. And then, in October, the cell door opened again, this time not to take a child, but to take her to trial. In the dim hours before dawn on October 14, 1793, the iron door swung open again. This time, not for food, nor for more jeers from the guards. This time, it was to drag her before the revolution's version of justice. A justice already carved in stone, long before she entered the room. Marie Antoinette was led through the corridors of the Conciergerie, surrounded by armed soldiers. Their boots echoed against the stone like distant funeral drums. She wore the same black dress she had used to mourn her executed husband. Yet her steps remained calm, almost unnervingly composed. People peered at her from shadowed corners. Some spat insults. Others simply stared, caught somewhere between dread and fascination. The revolutionary tribunal, crammed with spectators, looked more like a stage than a courtroom. Flickering torches lit up the judges' faces, rigid and expressionless as carved marble. And across from them, on a plain wooden bench, sat the woman who had once been Queen of France. No jewels now, no crown, only a thin, pale figure with a ghost-like dignity that refused to fade. Prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville opened the proceedings with a voice meant for spectacle. His words dripped with malice, every sentence crafted to provoke roars from the crowd. He listed the accusations with theatrical precision: treason, conspiring with foreign enemies, wasting the nation's money, corrupting the morals of France. Every phrase drew waves of cheers, jeers, and pounding fists. But no one cared about facts. The revolution needed a villain, a body on which to pin years of hunger, taxation, and war. And she was the chosen emblem. Marie Antoinette, denied proper counsel and given no time to prepare, spoke only when allowed. Her voice was quiet but steady. She denied the charges, not with outrage, but with the exhaustion of someone who already knew the outcome could not be altered. Witnesses filed in one after another. Some recited tales lifted straight from hate-filled pamphlets. Others invented stories on the spot. They spoke of decadent feasts, mocking banquets, excesses at Versailles. The audience howled with approval, feeding on every invented scandal. Then came the accusation that froze the entire room. The prosecutor held up a sheet of paper, paused dramatically, and announced the vilest charge of all, that she had committed incest with her own son. A chilling silence swept over the tribunal. Even some hardened revolutionaries dropped their gaze. Word rippled through the gallery. Little Louis Charles, ripped from her arms months before, had been coerced into signing a false confession. He had been coached to repeat horrifying phrases he couldn't even comprehend. Sentences designed to shatter the mother who loved him. For a moment, Marie Antoinette didn't move. She seemed carved from stone, staring into nothing. The judges waited. The spectators held their breath. Then she rose. She didn't look at the prosecutor or the jury. Instead, she turned toward the women in the back market. Women, mothers, the same ones who had marched to Versailles demanding bread. And in a voice as clear as a bell, she said only, "I appeal to all the mothers who are here." She needed no further explanation. A wave went through the crowd, murmurs, gasps, even tears. For an instant, the monstrous caricature from the pamphlets vanished, replaced by the truth. A mother torn from her child, humiliated beyond comprehension. Tinville, furious at the shift in mood, slammed his fist on the table and forced the proceedings onward. But something had cracked. A flicker of guilt, or perhaps humanity, passed across a few faces in the room. Marie Antoinette sank back into her seat, drained. That single moment had taken the last of her strength. The trial dragged on for 2 days, a carefully choreographed display of revolutionary power. Every question, every witness, every scrap of evidence was part of a performance whose ending had already been written. At dawn on October 16, the judges announced the verdict: guilty of high treason. The sentence: death by guillotine. The clerk asked if she had anything to say. She simply shook her head and whispered, "What more could I add?" The farce was complete. Yet in that moment, her quiet acceptance became its own form of resistance. No screaming, no begging, no bitterness. Only a woman standing straighter than the men who condemned her, as if her silence carried more honesty than anything spoken in the courtroom. That afternoon, she was led back to her cell. Behind her remained the cheers, the accusations, the triumphant cries of the crowd. Before her, the final morning of her life. Night fell over Paris on October 15, 1793, casting a deceptive calm over cell number 280 of the Conciergerie. The silence was so heavy that even the dripping water sounded like a clock marking her last hours. Marie Antoinette returned from her trial pale and trembling, yet her gaze seemed strangely peaceful, not the peace of hope, but of someone who had fully embraced the end. Rosalie, her loyal attendant, stayed close. She offered her broth and bread. The queen refused with a gentle smile. "I need nothing more, my child. Everything is finished for me." For a long while, she sat at the small wooden table, watching shadows dance across the damp wall. The Seine murmured outside, guards paced beyond the door. Then she picked up a quill and sheet of paper. Her hand shook, but her script remained steady. She wrote a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, the only person left to whom she felt tied by genuine affection. And in that letter, she wrote nothing of vengeance, fear, or the injustice she had endured. She wrote of forgiveness. She begged her sister-in-law to care for her daughter, to pray for little Louis Charles, and never hold him responsible for the words he had been forced to repeat. He had been misled, used as a pawn by those who wished to torment her. Her tone softened. "Tell him I do not blame him. Tell him I pray for him. Tell him that even in heaven, I will still be his mother." With every sentence, it was as if her spirit slowly pulled away from her tired body. The letter became her moral testament, her final whisper to the world. But her message never reached its intended hands. Revolutionaries seized it and buried it in their archives of hatred, where it remained hidden for more than 2 decades before being uncovered. When she placed the quill down, she stared at the candle barely clinging to life. Melted wax trailed across the table like falling tears. Rosalie noticed it too and broke down. "Do not cry," the queen told her softly. "We must die as we have lived, decently." At midnight, footsteps returned. The last order had arrived. The guards delivered it with a tone so cold and ordinary, it could have been a breakfast announcement. Marie Antoinette only nodded. No plea for mercy, no tremor of fear. Before they shut the door, she asked for one moment alone. Kneeling, she prayed, not for herself, but for her children. At that moment, she was no symbol, no monarch. She was simply a mother preparing to let go. By the time she rose, dawn was slipping through the crack in the wall. Paris was waking up, indifferent to her sorrow. In the streets, people spoke about bread, politics, and the coming execution, unaware that the woman who had once been the center of Europe's grandest court was quietly fixing her hair, wiping her cheeks, and preparing with eerie calm for death. Before drifting into a brief sleep, Rosalie heard her murmur, "May God give me the strength to die with courage." Then the candle went out. Its final glow hovered in the darkness like a fading promise. When the cell was swallowed by night, Marie Antoinette did not dream, she simply waited. At sunrise, the clanging of bolts marked the end of waiting. The day had come. The day France's most hated woman would show, one last time, the strength of her soul. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Paris awoke under a heavy, icy fog, as though even the sky hesitated to witness what the next hours would bring. In cell 280, the former queen stirred before the guards arrived. She had slept only a few minutes, resting her head on the same table where the unread letter still lay. Rosalie appeared with swollen eyes and a cup of water. "Would you like breakfast, Your Majesty?" Marie Antoinette gently shook her head. "No. Once I am gone, I need nothing more. My soul has fed enough on sorrow." At precisely 6 in the morning, the locks shifted. The door opened. The jailer announced bluntly, "It is time." 3 men entered behind him, a clerk, a National Guard officer, and the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, accompanied by his assistants. Everything had been arranged down to the smallest gesture, a ritual of stripping away her last fragments of dignity. A guard informed her she must change clothes. The order was simple: remove the black mourning dress she had worn since her husband's death. That dress was more than fabric. It was her memory, her symbol, the last strand connecting her to the life that had been stolen. She quietly asked for privacy. "Sir, please, allow me at least that." The guard laughed. There are no queens here. She was forced to change behind a poorly placed screen while they watched. They handed her a plain, rough, white linen gown, the color worn by penitents on the brink of death. The contrast was merciless. The woman who once wore silk and jewels now looked almost spectral in a garment not her own. When she finished, Sanson stepped forward, his voice flat and detached. "Your hair must be cut, madam." She didn't protest, she simply bowed her head. Her hands, once adorned with jewels and rings, folded quietly over her skirt. One assistant grabbed rusty scissors and brutally hacked off strands of her hair. White strands fell to the floor like fragments of her past. Once blonde, her hair had turned pale in prison, bleached by grief and time. The cutting was not just preparation. It was a ritual of erasing her womanhood, the final step before oblivion. When it was over, Sanson dropped the hair without a second glance. A guard approached, holding a thick rope. "We must bind your hands." Marie Antoinette looked up, stunned. "Why? My husband, the king, was not bound." Her voice was not rebellious, only sorrowful. No answer was given. Her wrists were tied so tightly, the rope bit into her skin. She swallowed a sound of pain. Before leaving, she made a request once unimaginable for a queen. "May I relieve myself for a moment?" They nodded with disdain. Humiliation was complete. Even the smallest human act had become part of the spectacle. When she stepped back into the room, the men straightened. Sanson said solemnly, "We must go." Marie Antoinette paused before Rosalie. The young woman trembled, unable to speak. The queen looked at her with tenderness. "Do not weep for me. I have suffered too much to fear death. God bless you." Then she walked toward the corridor. The passageway of the Conciergerie echoed with whispers, footsteps, and dread. As she approached, the guards removed their hats. No one dared meet her eyes. It wasn't fear, it was an involuntary respect. Something in her presence demanded quiet. When she reached the main gate, she saw the cart waiting for her, an open, rough wooden wagon, the same kind used for criminals and thieves. There were no exceptions for her. Her husband had been taken to his death in a closed carriage. She was offered up for display. The morning air bit sharply at the skin. The bells of Notre Dame blended with the rising shouts of people already filling the streets. She climbed into the cart without help, her wrists still bound. For a brief moment, she lifted her face toward the grey sky, inhaled deeply, and whispered words only Rosalie could hear. "Now my peace begins." The courthouse doors groaned open. The cart began to roll through the crowd. Jeers, insults, and laughter chased after her, but she stood motionless, upright, as though she no longer belonged to the living world. Her final journey to the Place de la Révolution had begun. The wooden cart creaked through the Paris streets, dragged by two exhausted horses. Mud stained its sides, along with traces left by previous prisoners. Inside it, Marie Antoinette stood tall, the wind tugging at her plain white gown and freshly cut hair. She looked like the last performer in a tragedy whose ending everyone already knew. The slow ride from the Conciergerie to the square lasted just over an hour. For the thousands crowding the roadsides, it became a procession. They wanted to witness her fall, wanted to see her broken. Some hurled insults. Others tossed stale bread. "There goes the widow Capet," they shouted, "the Austrian, the thief of France." Yet what disturbed most bystanders wasn't her presence, it was her silence. She did not react, she did not bow her head, she did not cry. Her expression remained composed, her posture unbent, her gaze fixed far ahead. The cold wind blew through her cropped hair, but she stood unshaken. Artists and chroniclers later wrote that her profile that day did not reflect arrogance, but a solemn, unsettling calm, a woman who had already made peace with her ending. From a balcony, a young man with sharp features observed intently. Jacques-Louis David, the painter of the Revolution, opened his sketchbook. He traced her outline, the long neck, the firm jaw, the hollow yet serene eyes. He was trying to capture not just her figure, but the precise moment when history and myth intertwined. That sketch would become one of the most iconic depictions of her downfall. The cart continued along Rue Saint-Honoré, guarded by lines of soldiers. Windows opened and slammed shut as it passed. Some watched her with open hatred, others with a restrained, guilty respect. Beneath the clatter of hooves, vendors' cries, and church bells, the city seemed to hold its breath. A gust of wind swirled dust into the air. The cart jolted violently over a stone. Marie Antoinette stumbled, nearly falling. A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd. But without aid, she straightened herself, lifting her chin as though nothing had happened. Nearby, the market women, those same women who had once marched to Versailles demanding bread, watched her closely. Some smirked cruelly. Others stared silently. "She doesn't look afraid," one whispered. "Perhaps she has nothing left to lose," another murmured back. The journey felt endless. The city's noise crashed around her like a storm, yet inside she was still. While the crowd saw a humiliated queen, she felt something different, something unexpected. For the first time in years, she felt free. Free from the court, from politics, from venomous rumors, from expectations, even from fear itself. Then the cart turned a final corner, and the scene opened before her. The Place de la Révolution. In the center, towering against the pale sky, stood the guillotine. Its dark wooden frame and gleaming metal blade cut a harsh silhouette in the midday light. A massive crowd pressed around the platform, buzzing with anticipation. Their murmur swelled into a roar. Marie Antoinette lifted her chin. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The wind brushed her face, and in that chaos, an unexpected tranquility washed over her. She understood that everything she had ever been, queen, wife, mother, would end on that wooden platform. But she also knew that her story no longer belonged to the men who dragged her there. The cart stopped. Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson stepped down first, followed by his assistants. One offered his hand to help her descend. She met his eyes and replied softly, "No, thank you. I can manage on my own." With her wrists bound and her feet steady, she climbed down from the cart amid the thunder of the crowd. Every step toward the wooden staircase echoed like the closing notes of a tragic symphony. The square thundered with shouts, fists in the air, mocking laughter, and the cold fascination that comes when an era dies before thousands of witnesses. The guillotine loomed above, silent and ready, its blade glinting under the sun. Marie Antoinette stared at it. There was no terror in her eyes, only a remarkable, almost otherworldly calm. She ascended the steps slowly. Her tied hands made her movements shaky, but she refused assistance. Executioner Sanson stepped forward to guide her. And in that instant, fate played its last cruel trick. As she turned, her foot brushed against his. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The executioner stared at her, startled, just before she spoke her final words. Clear, soft, almost gentle. "Forgive me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." No scream, no curses, no desperate pleading. Just an apology. So simple, so human, that it stunned even those who had come to celebrate her death. That small, humble gesture became her last triumph. In that single breath, the woman stripped of her crown, her children, her identity, even her name, reclaimed the one thing her enemies could never confiscate, her dignity. The assistants laid her on the wooden plank. The air around the scaffold tightened with anticipation. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice erupted. "Long live the Republic." Thousands roared back in unison. Sanson gave the signal. The mechanism snapped, a harsh, metallic sound. A heartbeat later, the blade fell with ruthless precision. Her body went still. The executioner lifted her head by its pale hair, raising it before the masses. A violent cheer rolled across the square. Long live the nation. Long live liberty. For them, it was the victory of the revolution. For her, it was release. Some witnesses later whispered that they had seen something unusual, an expression of peace lingering on her face, a calm that seemed untouched by violence. Others claimed the sky darkened moments after the blade dropped, as though the entire city held its breath. Her body was placed into a covered cart alongside the remains of those executed before her. No rites, no prayers, no coffin. She was taken to the Madeleine Cemetery and thrown into a mass grave among strangers. There were no flowers to mark the spot, no cross to honor her name, only soil and silence. The crowd eventually dispersed. The thud of marching boots faded, leaving only the hollow echo of the guillotine's trapdoor closing. On the balconies and rooftops, some lingered, staring at the empty space where a queen had fallen, unable to grasp that history had just shifted. But her story didn't end there. They buried her like a criminal, but her memory refused to stay underground. That quiet apology to her executioner, whispered in the face of death, slowly transformed into a symbol proof that even in the depths of cruelty, humanity can endure. Marie Antoinette, the foreign queen blamed for every misfortune, died with a grace that no blade could destroy. The guillotine claimed her life, but not her spirit. In the moment the steel struck her neck, her dignity rose above the crowd's roar, above the hatred, above her own tragic era. In that single second, her eternal second, she reclaimed her true throne. The square emptied. The shouting died out. Under the grey Paris sky, the scaffold stood silent. Her body, anonymous now, was carried to the Madeleine Cemetery, where nameless graves swallowed the victims of the revolution. Queens, thieves, strangers, all equal under the weight of earth. For years, no one could say where she lay. Her name vanished from official records, deliberately erased. The revolutionaries believed they had ended her story forever. But symbols cannot be buried. Time passed, and her death began to take the shape of legend. It was said that after her execution, a young sculptor was summoned to capture her features. Marie Antoinette